Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see all of your beautiful faces, even though most of you have your cameras off. And I'm so excited to share the experience of South Asian Youth Initiative 2021 conference with you. My name is Maya Shah, and I go by she, her. I'm a sophomore at Yale studying psychology and women, gender, and sexuality studies. And throughout this past year, I've had the pleasure working alongside my co-director, Saket.
Hey y'all, my name is Saket. I'm also a sophomore at Yale University. I use he, him pronouns. I'm studying ethnicity, race, and migration, and environmental studies. I'm really excited to be working here with Maya and you all.
And before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the lands on which we are settled upon. We are coming from many places today, and we want to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who have been here since time immemorial, and to recognize that we must continue to build our solidarity and kinship with Native peoples across the Americas and across the globe. The schools that we attend are born out of a history of Indigenous oppression. We want to acknowledge and educate ourselves on whose land we reside on as a first step in pushing for tangible changes in our systems and institutions and moving towards justice for Indigenous peoples. Yale, and what is now known as New Haven, occupies Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples. We also acknowledge that this country would not exist if it were not for the free and slave labor of Black people. We honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life, knowledge, and skills stolen due to violence and white supremacy. Understanding Black and Indigenous oppression is a central part of SAYI's theme: solidarity, resistance, and radical organizing. We hope that the programming we have today and tomorrow will give us lessons to better understand the struggles of marginalized communities and push for justice for all.
So although we couldn't have our SAI 2021 conference in person on Yale's campus as we did last year, we're still really excited to connect with participants from literally all around the world. I saw from the chat we have students from Nepal, from India, from all over the United States, from Canada, um, and so much more. So we're allowed to get like so many more experiences than just those who are like in the northeastern United States. I think that's super exciting.
If you see the picture at the top there, that's the only picture Saket and I have from last year's conference. Kind of a horrible picture, but I'm glad we took it. And right next to that are the past co-directors of SAI 2020. And we just want to give a huge shout out to them for helping us get through all of this and figure out how to put all of this together. They're truly amazing people. So thank you, Ananya and Elisa.
Yes, they definitely laid the groundwork for everything. Um, so Transitioning to an online platform has been like really difficult, especially in getting us like socially engaged in addition to learning together. But our team has like worked really hard to bring you all like these like exciting and impactful conference. So this just theme, solidarity, resistance, and radical organizing, is kind of meant to inspire students of the South Asian diaspora and in South Asia to continue the activism well after the conference, because for far too long there's been like a really big disconnect between students in the diaspora and in South Asia and these two activism spheres. So we hope SAI can help connect us to each other and kind of learn how we can all be supporting each other in our own justice movements.
And since this year is a little bit different, I want to give you guys a bit of a rundown for this week's schedule, as well as some of the free prizes that will be raffled out to our participants. So I'm dropping a link in the chat so that you all can have a link to this schedule itself. This should have the schedule for today and tomorrow, all of the different names of the events, as well as their time periods. And we'll begin today's schedule with a conversation with our keynote speaker, Christina Dhanaraj, and she'll be here at 10 o'clock. And there's a short half-hour break for lunch after that, preceding the Gender and Violence workshop beginning at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Then we'll have the South Asian Me Too movements panel at 1:30, the South Asian American Studies panel at 3, the LGBTQ identifying icebreaker at 4:30, tech discrimination panel at 5, labor organizing workshop at 6:30, and finally the faith-based icebreaker at 8 p.m. So to attend any of these events, you use the same exact link that you used today to come to these opening remarks, and I'm going to drop that in the chat as well. It's just tinyurl.com SAYI Day 1. And this year we're going to be using icebreaker.video to help students meet each other one-on-one in a virtual setting. And the links to that are also in the schedule itself. And you should be able to add that schedule to your Google Calendar.
So this year we're going to be raffling out 50 copies of 6 different books, kind of related to the panels in which you're required to attend to be eligible for those raffles. So you can see which books are being shared over here. I don't think I'm going to like run through all of them, but in this next event, our keynote speaker with Christina Dhanaraj, she's a Dalit feminist, and we're going to be giving out the book coming out as Dalit Paryashakanda. And she kind of Doc talks about her Dalit experience growing up in the United States. So I think it's really important for students, especially in the US, to read and understand what that experience is like. Um, yes, yes.
And we'll also be raffling out some items in support of 2 South Asian businesses, which you are eligible for if you attend both SAYI opening statements. So you are halfway there. You're already at this one. Just come to the one tomorrow. That lasts the same amount of time, about 15 minutes, and you'll be eligible for both of them. This first one here is the Snapback, which is offering 1-year premium access to the Snapback app, valued at $239.99, which presents state-of-the-art intuitive technology created to cater to each individual mama or baby based on their mental and physical health, resources, and delivery type and circumstances. The function of the app is to provide individualized rehab experience to assist women in pregnancy or postpartum at an affordable, accessible, and informative rate. I know that this is maybe a little bit odd for our age group. If you are a college student here, I know that there are some grad students who are attending, but if it isn't a gift that you would want to use for your own circumstances, it's totally a gift that you can re-gift to a friend or a family member. And then we also have another South Asian business.
Yeah, so Malicious Jewelry was born to kind of empower women artisans and rejuvenate jewelry around the world. A really amazing goal to support dwindling these kinds of dwindling art forms and tell stories from the past by combining traditional artisanship with modern technology as a kind of whole new way of designing and producing and selling jewelry. Malicious Jewelry is offering these red elephant earrings valued at $30 from the New York Fashion Week collection. This 18 karat gold um, coated huggy hoops with red coral stone elephant charms is like a really great addition to your look. Or it could be a gift for your friends and family. If you got any questions about how the raffle works, please like just private message me in the chat. In a few minutes, Maya's also going to send a check-in form. So if you fill that out, we'll know that you came here and you'll be eligible for this raffle.
Oh, I also forgot to put in the chat a link to the raffle requirements in case you want to look at them later. All of the things that I am sending to you in the chat are also on all of our social medias, our Instagram, which is at South Asian Youth Initiative, and our website, southasianyouth.initiative.com, and our Facebook at SAYI 2021. So now I would like to welcome our first keynote speaker, Christina Dhanaraj. Ms. Dhanaraj is a writer and a consultant for women and minority-led initiatives focusing on social justice, self-determination, and collaborative models of scholarship. She's currently an advisor for Smashboard, which she will talk about in a bit, and she was the co-founder of the Dalit History Month project and a volunteer for the Dalit Women Fight. Her interests lie in the politics of identity, diversity and inclusion, mental health, and intersectional discourses between caste, gender, religion, race, and sexuality. Today, Ms. Dhanaraj will speak on what her fight for Dalit rights has looked like in India and how students of the diaspora can support activists fighting casteism, Hindu nationalism, land rights, and other issues affecting South Asia. So please welcome Christina Dhanaraj. I'm going to let her give a bit of a brief introduction.
Hi, everyone. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, are you able to see it? Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be meeting you all. And thank you, Sake, thank you, Maya, for getting in touch with me and having me do this. Thank you so much, Maya, for that lovely and very kind introduction. I hope to do justice to all that you have mentioned that I will be covering in this presentation. One thing that I will not be talking about for sure is the bit on Hindu nationalism and land rights. Those are not the things that I'll be covering in today's presentation. But I will definitely kind of, if you would like to, I can touch upon it if you all have any specific questions, if any of you have any specific questions regarding that. So today's talk is going to essentially try and ground all of us into what it means to be anti-caste, what is caste, and what can we do both as individuals, as families, as collectives towards anti-caste activism. I'm currently on a sabbatical. It's taken a long time for me to finally call myself a writer, although I've been writing since I was 16 years old. And I essentially started off doing chemistry. I hold a double master's degree in chemistry. And then I went on to work in a corporate space for almost 12 plus years. And then I finally decided that it's time to do things that I've always wanted to do. And I'm currently on hopefully a year-long sabbatical, but I'm not sure how longer this is going to take. As Maya mentioned, I'm also an advisor for Smashboard, which is essentially a feminist digital platform. Hopefully, when it does become fully public, we will all be able to become participants on that app, which essentially gives you access to a host of feminist services or legal aids. The objective behind that app is to essentially address sexual violence and support survivors of sexual violence. I'm also the co-founder of Dalit History Month, and that makes today's session even more special because we are celebrating Dalit History Month as we speak. We started Dalit History Month sometime early 2015, and it started off as an idea, but today it has become an annual community observance, which Dalits and Dalit people all over the globe, as well as anti-caste allies, have taken upon themselves to celebrate it in different ways. I'm also a consultant for women and minority-led initiatives, which means I help particularly nonprofit initiatives that are led by women or by minorities in their strategy, in their organizational effectiveness, anything and everything that they need to be a lot more efficient and effective as an organization. I'm not an academic, so it's possible that some of your questions will not be answered from an academic or a theorizing perspective, but I do write and I theorize quite a bit in my writing, but most of it is very much part political and part personal. So for today's talk, we will be looking at 4 major things. We will ground ourselves in the understanding of what is caste, and then we will go on to understand how does caste manifest itself, and then eventually try to understand what anti-caste activism has looked like and what it is looking like currently, and finally end it with anti-caste allyship. I must say that I prepared this presentation with mostly a non-Dalit audience in mind, but I don't want to assume that all of you are from upper caste locations or from non-Dalit locations. So if you happen to be from a Dalit social location, or if you are from a non-upper caste location, then then please understand that not all of this is relevant for you. There are, of course, other ways in which you will be contributing. If you are a Dalit, you will be contributing to anti-caste activism, and it could potentially take on a completely different format. So I would like to start off with a famous quote by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And for those of you, let me assume that all of you know who Dr. B.R. Ambedkar is. He is the architect of the Indian Constitution. He also happens to be Dalit, and he's one of our leaders who essentially changed the very landscape of how we see caste and how we see ourselves, right? And one of his most famous quotes is, caste is not a physical object like a wall of bricks or a line of barbed wire which prevents the Hindus from commingling and which has therefore to be pulled down. Caste is a notion, it is a state of mind. So what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar essentially says here is that caste is not something that is so easy as that of a wall or a barbed wire or a barbed fence, that all that you would be required to do is simply, turn off the locks or simply pluck off the locks and get that wall out. But it is a state of mind. It is a notion. It is a belief. It is a way of life for people who have been Indian or who've born into the Indian subcontinent. It is the way we lead our life. It is so integrated into each of our ways of thinking, in the way we do things, in the way we make friendships, in the way we engage and interact in our relationships, in the way we eat food. So it's present across all aspects of our lives. So what B.R. Ambedkar is asking us to see is that being anti-caste or stripping our lives of caste would require more than just pulling down a wall or removing a barbed fence. It takes more than just one action. So the best way to understand India's caste system is this fairly simple pyramid structure. In reality, though, India's caste system is a lot more complex than this. It is made of millions of castes and subcastes, not millions, thousands of castes and subcastes. And it takes a lot of understanding. In fact, it takes a lifetime, in fact, to try and understand where each subcaste would come under, which state categories, which social categories all fall under. So this is more of a diluted, simple way to understand how caste works in India. So onto the left, you would see antiquity, and onto the right, you would see current in this pyramid. And the best way to define India's caste system, of course, people define it in different ways. I personally like this definition, which is, it is one of the world's oldest socio-religious structures that determines people's access to resources, capital, land, and knowledge at birth. The key emphasis here is at birth, meaning you will be born into a certain caste, and that in and by itself will determine your future, your present, even the future of your children and their children. So in antiquity, again, the broader categorizations or the broader stratification looked like, Brahmins occupying the topmost category, typically taking up the labor of teaching, being intellectuals, or working as priests in temples, followed by Kshatriyas, who were typically warriors or rulers or kings, followed by the Vaishyas, who typically were merchants, craftsmen, goldsmiths, people who dealt with money, right? And then followed by Shudras, who typically did labor, like, farming or any kind of, hard labor that required being shepherds or doing all kinds of hard labor, right? Now, the untouchables category that you see here is not by definition part of this system. They are in fact supposed to be out of the system, and they are called as today's Dalits. Dalit is a term that we took on for ourselves. I belong to an ex-untouchable family. I'm a Dalit myself. And it was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar who helped us in a way to take on this term, right, as Dalit. And we today no longer use the word untouchable. We prefer to use the word Dalits. We prefer to identify as Dalits. So on the right, you would see upper castes, other backward classes, and scheduled castes. Now, upper castes are typically the ones that are made of the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas. And they are, you could understand them as India's ruling class that has historically dominated government, business, and education, and continue to in across professions, across industries, across domains in India. This is followed by the other backward classes, typically made of the Shudra castes. They are also historically disadvantaged communities that have also benefited from India's policies of affirmative action. That's followed by the scheduled castes. Now, scheduled castes is a state category. Dalits is an identity that we've chosen to represent ourselves as, and untouchables is an antiquated term. If you do have any questions regarding this, you could always ask during the Q&A session. So having understood what is fairly a simple understanding of how the caste system works in India, we have to also realize that caste is not just an Indian problem. You may have heard this quite often, where people would constantly, especially outside of India, or even when Indians migrate out of India and get to other places, they would say something like, you know, caste is a thing of the past, or that caste is very much prevalent in India, and that too only in rural places. But this is not true. We've seen time and again that caste is not limited to just India or even just the Indian subcontinent, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Equality Labs that's based out of the United States, but very recently they released a report called as Caste in the United States. Over here, it's accessible, it's free, you could all go ahead and read it. It's one of, it's a very detailed report that's based on survey, that's based on a fairly extensive survey that proves how caste is still alive and kicking in the United States. The same goes for countries like South Africa, the United Kingdom, Malaysia, Australia. I did my graduate studies in Singapore, and it's pretty much the same case. So wherever there is a South Asian dominance, or wherever there is a significant South Asian population, caste is present amongst the South Asians, right? And this, in a way, is not very surprising for those of us who have been caste affected, because Dr. B.R. Ambedkar predicted this to happen a long time ago. He said, and I quote, "The caste problem is a vast one, both theoretically and practically. Practically, it is an institution that portends tremendous consequences. It is a local problem, but one capable of much wider mischief. For as long as caste in India does exist, Hindus will hardly intermarry or have any social intercourse with outsiders. And if Hindus migrate to other regions on earth, Indian caste would become a world problem." And evidently so, we've seen this happen. Every time South Asians migrate, they carry caste with them. You may have noticed this in your own communities, where people would practice caste in very creative and very innovative ways, some of which I'm hoping you would be able to share at the end of this session. Moving on to how caste manifests. I think an important thing to understand is that caste manifests across a spectrum in covert and overt ways within all and between castes through both atrocities and microaggressions, right? Remember, I highlighted to you at the beginning that caste is not just a wall or a barbed fence that you can just pull down. Caste is a way of life. Caste is so integrated in all of our lives. So caste will manifest itself in various ways, in different formats, across communities within South Asians. And it will also manifest itself when South Asians are interacting with other communities or other races or other groups of people. But off late, whenever we talk about caste and whenever we talk about the caste problem, we tend to focus more on the effects and consequences. To quote an example, whenever there is an argument between people about whether caste exists or not, the way to prove that caste exists, people would, throw statistics of atrocities against Dalits. They would say, for those of you who think caste doesn't exist, see what has just happened in a state in Uttar Pradesh in India where a Dalit woman was sexually assaulted. Now tell us that caste doesn't exist. So in a way, they are using an atrocity or a heinous crime against a lower caste person as proof for caste and its manifestation. But this is not just what proves to us that caste exists. It's not just the effects and consequences of caste that tell us that caste is alive, but the fact that caste exists in all of our communities, in our beliefs, in our mindsets, in the way we behave with each other and with others, in the preferences we have, whether it comes to our relationships or whether it comes to our cultural liking, what kind of music we like, what kind of arts we go for, what kind of rituals we follow, the festivals that we celebrate, the practices that we have, that we still follow, right? And what kind of access do we all have, right? And what kind of capital do we all possess? Who are the people that mostly migrate? Like, who holds the highest percentage of migration among South Asian communities in the US or in any other so-called first world countries? What kind of politics do you espouse? What kind of cultural capital that you have, or cultural capital that you can access, and the privilege that you hold by virtue of all of these, right? So it's important to identify how caste manifests within oppressor communities as much as we take the effort to identify how caste affects and has consequences in oppressed communities, right? So I think it's really important for us to see that difference. An example onto the right is, you may have, I'm going to go ahead and assume that all of you have watched Netflix's Indian matchmaking, and you may have noticed how people find mates within South Asian communities, even within India, and how caste is such an important aspect of love, even. Matrimonials, where even today in India, in your classifieds, you would have people asking specifically for people within that one caste that they belong to. Or in some cases, they would very explicitly say, except scheduled castes, or except Dalits. Open to marrying anybody, caste no bar, but except Dalits or except scheduled castes. That's essentially untouchability in a very modern, in a very new format, but it still manifests in the way it does, right? I'm not sure if this product is available in the US, but we have a host of food products that call itself, that is marketed as those coming from Brahmin cooking, or a very traditionally Brahmin, and this is done in the aim that it will be marketable, it will be seen as something of higher value than other food products. Caste is social capital. What kind of networks do people have by virtue of the caste that they belong to? We see this especially in corporates, in the private sector, back in India, and perhaps even in the United States or in other countries, where you see that um, upper castes tend to occupy most of the leadership positions. And we often kind of mask that by saying it's networking that helps them get where they do. But who's to say that networking doesn't happen by virtue of caste, right? You may have seen this poster that became quite infamous in the last few months of, an actor in India, uh, acting in a biopic about a former chief minister, Mayawati, in India, and where they had depicted the chief minister as holding a broom, right? And if you can see this, it says untouchable, unstoppable. So these are stereotypes that continue in the way caste manifests. So caste essentially translates itself into stereotypes that Dalits are constantly being boxed under. Bharatanatyam, I urge you to follow this conversation if you are someone who's interested in dance forms or art forms that are Indian or that are South Asian in origin, and to see how caste interacts with that art form. There's someone who does this, who leads this discourse in India. Her name is Nritya Pillai, and she talks about how Bharatanatyam has to be understood from the perspective of caste, or from the perspective of being anti-caste. What does it mean to be anti-caste and to admire or to practice Bharatanatyam, right? And another statistic that I came across is upper caste Hindus in India own 41% of the country's total wealth. And if you would go out there and look at such statistics, it's undeniable how caste has essentially influenced pretty much everything as far as the oppressor castes are concerned. And yet every time we talk about how caste manifests itself, we tend to focus on the right and not on the left. So one of the things that we need to do right off at the beginning, before we even want to organize, or so even before we want to do activism within the anti-caste space, is to know how to identify and introspect and reflect on how caste manifests itself within our own castes if we come from oppressor social locations. So on that note, let's try and understand what anti-caste activism looked like and it looks like today. I will not be able to talk about how anti-caste organizing happens within the South Asian space in the United States. But I can talk about what are the major formats that anti-caste activism typically takes and what it has taken in the last many centuries, right? So when we think about anti-caste activism, and this happens every decade, is that people kind of wake up to it anew, in the sense like if someone were to ask a contemporary or a peer about what is anti-caste activism, they would choose to talk about only what is happening on social media, right? They would choose to talk about only Instagram handles or the kind of discourses that are happening on Twitter, like as though anti-caste activism can be encapsulated into these, just social media sort of activities. But the truth about anti-caste activism is that given that caste has been in place and caste has been alive and active for thousands of years, anti-caste activism has also been happening thousands of years. It's possible that history has not been recorded. It's possible that people, those who told that story, were not, anti-caste activists themselves or Dalits themselves. And it's highly possible that people have simply forgotten what that anti-caste activism looked like back then, right? I would like to read out to you one of the earliest known anti-caste activist activist actions, so to say. One of the earliest known active anti-caste actions. The Tamil Periya Puranam, the great epic in a Tamil poetic account depicting the legendary lives of the 63 Nayanas, the canonical Tamil poets of the 20th century. One poem refers to the story of Nandanar, a Pulayar, an untouchable caste in India. It is said that he used to supply leather for drum and straps, strings for lutes, and various instruments for the worship of God. He was known for his deep devotion to Shiva and was longing to visit the Nataraja temple of Chidambaram, but feared that his low birth would serve a hindrance to his temple entry. One day he gathered enough courage and started out for Chidambaram, and on reaching was overwhelmed by both happiness and despair outside the high wall of the temple. He wasn't allowed in because of his caste. On hearing his wails, it is written that God himself appeared before the priests and commanded them to light a fire and lead Nandanar into the inner sanctum of the temple. Some Dalits see this as an act of courage, since for most Dalits of that time, entering a temple could mean instant murder by the upper caste. He also won for his people the freedom to sing. Even if he only sang of his pain as a Dalit and his longing for God, still for the first time, a Dalit voice was heard of popularly. So Nandanar is a very early example, but over the centuries, we've had several examples of activists, of several examples of people belonging to lower castes, of Dalits who have resisted, who have fought against the system, who've offered the counters in so many different ways, right? And they've done it at the face of violence and the threat of murder and the threat of assault and the threat of dishonor, right? And so when, even as allies or even as anti-caste activists, when we want to participate in this movement, or when we feel like we want to contribute to this movement, we have to understand that we are not the first ones. We are not even the second ones, right? We are part of a history, part of a long history of anti-caste activism that has taken different formats. In general, though, I believe anti-caste activism can take two major categories. One is the empowerment of people who have been oppressed. And two is that of challenging power structures that are keeping these people oppressed. The things that you see in the name of anti-caste activism today, in my understanding at least, typically falls within either of these categories, right? So if you're looking at community mobilizing and organizing, whether it's within South Asian spaces or whether it's what happens in India, it is very much all about challenging the power structures, challenging caste structures, challenging caste hegemony, challenging governments that keep these hegemonical structures alive. You have political leadership of Dalits of Dalits gaining and wanting to gain electoral political power, being able to have collaborations and negotiate with other politicians and be able to gain political power so that they can bring about political change, so that they can bring about social change. There's also a group of activists that work in policy making and lobbying, where they're constantly negotiating and they're constantly convincing governments and policymakers to change laws, to change policies that's going to help people, right? And then there are media interventions, where people within the media and outside of media are protesting for alternative depictions of caste atrocities and of Dalits, and breaking stereotypes in the course of it. When you look at empowerment, and a lot of this you would be seeing of late is that uh, uh, a lot of writing has been happening within the Dalit space. And again, I think it's very unfortunate that when we talk about Dalit writing and Dalit literature, we think about the most popular person that's there on our minds at this current point of time. But that is not the only thing, right? That is not the only example. That example, whichever it is that you're thinking, is a product of a history of anti-caste writing, history of Dalit writing that has happened, right? Mass conversions took place in the early 1920s and 1950s, and even in the 19th century. My parents were second generation Christian converts, meaning my great grandparents converted into Christianity, and they saw conversion into Christianity as a way out of caste, right? So again, these were all keeping the empowerment of their own communities in mind. The fact that conversions could give people access to education, to a place of worship, access to all kinds of capital, maybe even a community. So all of this happened wanting to break out of caste oppression. You have arts and culture. We've seen a lot of Dalit art over many decades. In fact, we have musical forms, we have dances. Of late, we've seen a lot of visual art on social media. Education was also a route that people took to empower themselves, and they continue to take that as a route. Survivor support is something that groups, anti-caste activists work on, particularly groups that work with Dalit women and Dalit sexual minorities, right? I volunteered for Dalit Women Fight a couple of years ago, and the kind of work activists do on the ground is close to. I mean, it's amazing in the sense that they are the only people that survivors can truly depend on for legal aid, for any kind of help, for medical help. And by survivors, I mean survivors of caste-based sexual violence. Political discourses, something that we see happening in today's world quite um, uh, quite extensively. We've been writing, we've been talking about it, we've been having Instagram lives, we've had Zoom conversations, we have all kinds of political discourses, ideological discourses that we've all engaged in, particularly people who belong to lower caste communities or caste affected communities, because they are realizing that it's time that they tell their own stories without having upper caste gazing, without having upper caste determining what their stories are going to look like and what their stories are going to be stereotyped as. There's also capital, which I believe falls under empowerment, wherein acquiring all kinds of capital, and not just economic, but also social, but also intellectual capital, is seen as a route to empower ourselves. Now, this is to say that anti-caste activism isn't just about what's happening at the moment, and anti-caste activism isn't just what happens as far as organizing and mobilizing is concerned. I invite you to see anti-caste activism as something that has been happening for many centuries, and as also something that has taken different formats over a period of time. So you might find some of these pictures familiar. On the left, you have Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who in 1911, if I'm right, led a group of Dalits to drink water from a public water tank, which was denied to them. Right here, you have the Beam Army, Chandrasekhar Azad, addressing a group of Dalits. To Dalit Women Fight, that did self-respect yatras both in India as well as in the US. This picture might be a lot more familiar, wherein a group of Dalit women came to the United States to do a 3-month long self-respect tour, wherein they went about going, wherein they went to visited different colleges and institutions to talk about caste, Dalit History Month, and the work that Dalit women are doing back home in India. We have had different kinds of writing. The Weave of Life, which was an autobiography by Urmila Pawar. We have Karakul, one of my most favorite writers, Bama, and this is a book that I'm yet to read, but it's something that I want to, by Roja Singh, Spotted Goddesses. This is a conference that we got together to organize in 2017, where for the first time, Dalit women across the country and globally came together to have a conference that was completely conceptualized and organized and held by Dalit women themselves. We hardly had any allies participating in theorizing, in talking about issues. So it was a very interesting conference that I helped organize as well as be part of. You may have heard of the movie Kala by Pa Ranjit. People are making, segues into the domain of art and culture, like they have been doing for a long time, but they're now becoming part of pop culture as well, becoming commercial as well. And all of this is happening while there are protests, while there is organizing, and while there is mobilizing going on the other hand. Finally, what does anti-caste allyship look like, right? Again, I would like to remind that this presentation, or this slide in particular, was prepared assuming that I was going to talk to a predominantly upper caste audience or predominantly a non-Dalit audience. So if you happen to come from a Dalit social location, I urge you to see this slide as something that you would pass on to your upper caste friend or an upper caste colleague or an upper caste ally, but to realize that your role in anti-caste activism would be very different from what this looks like. Yeah. So I think one of the foremost things that as an anti-caste ally that one must do is come to terms with their individual position of privilege and power. That means doing and having a complete overhaul of what you believe to be right and wrong, to be to understand what oppression and to understand what oppression looked like, to understand what being an oppressor and what being a victim looks like. It's quite possible that you could be oppressing, that you could be holding on to a position of extreme privilege and power without you knowing about it. So it's extremely important that you come to terms with your own privilege, which could be by virtue of your caste and all that caste brings to you, right? All that caste gives you, all the access that your caste location gives you, the friendships that you're able to make, the relationships that you're able to forge, the capital that you're able to access, the education that you've been able to have, the networks, the wealth, the experiences that you've been able to have, all of this, all of your life, all of what you've had and all of what you're going to have could very well be by virtue of your caste position. Secondly, is to introspect and reflect on how you, your families, and your communities practice caste or are oblivious to it. In my opinion, this is one of the most difficult things to do, right? It is relatively easier to go and help someone or to, take up a placard or take up a banner and stand on the street and rally. Of course, it can be difficult for a lot of people, but relatively speaking, it's so much easier to be out there fighting than to go back home and to have these internal difficult conversations with your own people, or even with your own self, with your own friends who are practicing caste. It could be as simple as not letting the domestic worker that's helping you drink out of the same cup that you use at home, right? Not letting, so in India, where I was living in Bangalore for almost 5 years, the apartments that I rented, there would be signs that says um, housekeeping staff should not access lifts, should not access the elevators, right? That is caste in action. But to be able to go to the person in charge and to say, hey, that's wrong, we are not supposed to be doing that, that is actually caste-based discrimination, is a lot more difficult than taking a placard or a banner and standing on the street protesting, right? Thirdly, there is an immense need to educate yourself. There is an immense need to read and to consume all kinds of anti-caste writing and Dalit writing that has already been done, right? Most often I have experienced this quite often every time I have addressed an audience, and I've had people tell me, hey, we don't know what caste is. Could you tell us how to approach this? Can you teach us? Can you direct us to resources? And I do that most often. I do direct them to resources. I do give them suggestions for books or videos or all kinds of writing. But beyond a certain point, the labor of knowing and the effort that one needs to take in order to understand what being anti-caste looks like falls on you. The onus is on you to educate yourself, to seek knowledge and to seek wisdom and to seek guidance from the work and the labor that has already been done by people who belong to caste-affected communities. And finally, to identify what anti-caste actions, what are those anti-caste actions that you can take individually and collectively as people who are in your own institutions, in your social locations, in your communities, in your collectives, in your groups. What is it that you can do from an action perspective, right? And I believe almost all actions that you can envision or you can think of essentially should fall within these three categories. There could be above and beyond this, of course, but generally speaking, you have to be able to deploy the privilege that you already have. So if you have completed this step, not completed, if you have attempted the first step, then you would know what your positions of privilege and power are. To give you an example, if you believe there is an opportunity, and if you believe that you will be that your access to that network or your access to that opportunity or your access to somebody who's in charge or who's leading that opportunity can help another person, then pass on that information to another person, right? This is just one example of how you can deploy your privilege, but there are many other ways to deploy your privilege, as simple as sponsoring a caste-affected community's work back home in India, or even in the United States, or wherever it is that you think people are doing anti-caste work, to sponsor them, monetarily speaking, or in terms of labor, in terms of work, right? Secondly, is to intervene. And this falls within, kind of overlaps with the second point that I mentioned, is wherever you see something casteist that is happening, with the resources that you have and with the infrastructure that you have and with the strength that you have and the confidence that you can muster at that moment, please be willing to intervene and to stop anything casteist from happening. We see this a lot on social media today. We see people calling out, calling in. We see a lot of cancel culture happening. I'm not necessarily recommending that you get involved in all of that in full go without, introspecting or without doing the actual groundwork. But I'm saying that is one example of how people intervene. When you know somebody is doing something casteist, it's extremely important for you as an ally to intervene and to stand up and speak up, not necessarily on behalf of a caste-affected person, but more so to call out your peer, your colleague, somebody who belongs to your community who's doing something incredibly casteist or who's doing something that is offensive. Finally, to amplify, right? it's possible that you may not believe that you have capital or you have visibility or you have access. But trust me, if you belong to an upper caste social location, by default, by virtue of that very thing, the access that you have and the reach that you have will most definitely be higher and more expansive and wider. So use that privilege and use and deploy that privilege to amplify the work of anti-caste activists. And this is not just about anti-caste activists who are on social media, but also people who are doing work on the ground, right? So part of that action would be to go and identify organizations, groups, and collectives who are working with Dalits, who are working with caste-affected communities, and finding out what is it that you can do in terms of contributions, in terms of amplification, in terms of spreading the message, and in terms of making other people aware of what they're doing, right? I hope you will have more questions that will help us have a richer conversation. But with this, I close. And thank you very much. If you have any further questions that will go beyond today's session, you could always find me on Twitter, Instagram, or email me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful introduction. You were truly an inspiration with all the amazing work you've done. I just learned so much from that. And to get you a little bit to get to know you a little bit more, we have a couple of questions prepared for you. But before we start with the Q&A session, we want to send in the raffle check-in in the chat. So you can fill out this Google form and it'll automatically place you in the raffle to get the free ebook that Sakit was talking about earlier. Did you send it in the chat?
Yeah,
well, he's about to send it in the chat. So keep an eye out for that. So if you also have questions within the participants in the audience, feel free to send that directly to Sakit in the chat, and we'll ask you to unmute and ask your question at some point. And if you don't want to unmute and ask your question, feel free to just type in that you'd rather have Sakit or me ask it instead. So as a broader beginning, let's begin with this question. What inspired you to become an activist, writer, and organizer?
So I do want to correct one thing about it. I used to be part of organizing, but I no longer do full-time organizing. I would say that I'm still doing a bit of activist stuff here and there. I mean, in the traditional definition of activism. Writing, yes, I do writing quite a bit. What inspired me is this inherent wanting and need to tell my story, right? I grew up as a Dalit. I now embrace that identity a lot more openly and a lot more readily and willingly. But back then, I was not in this place. I was facing discrimination without really knowing that it was because of my caste. So essentially, most of my childhood and most of my teenage years or my years in college were spent just wondering what was so wrong with me that people would treat me the way they do, right? So it's unfortunate, but it is this experience that essentially inspired me, pushed me to do what I have to do. Because if you are not willing to tell your own story in the most authentic and in the most real way, then how do you get to touch another person who's going through the same thing as you are? And to me, that has been my thumb rule. That has been the guiding thought for me ever since I realized that I must tell my story. And over the years, there has been a lot of counter to that from different factions, where people have told me that you should not be washing out dirty linen in the public. You shouldn't be so vulnerable. And then there are people who are saying all that vulnerability that you're putting out is not true. So that essentially should strengthen your resolve. At least for me, it did. That I must keep telling my story. I must keep writing. I must keep doing what I do, because this is the only way that I can live. This is the only way I can survive, and this is the only way I can even thrive.
That's truly amazing to be going from something that is a very hard experience and pushing through to bring change. Thank you for sharing that. So, going a little bit off of that, you touched on this in your introduction a bit. How has your experience as a Dalit woman affected your journey in terms of obstacles, opportunities, and people you've interacted with? And what are some specific experiences you can recall? And how did you get past those different obstacles?
Yeah, so I think it's still a journey. I wouldn't say that I have gotten past those obstacles and barriers. I think, like I said, when I introduced the caste system to you, I said that this is something that determines your life, your future, right? So everything is determined at birth. So it's not something that you can just snap out of. It's not something that you can just, it's not a wall that you can just pull down. So just because I have embraced this identity, just because I've willingly and openly saying that I'm Dalit and I'm here to stay, that does not magically take away the obstacles or the barriers that I have faced for so long and I continue to face, right? So there is some bit of resilience that you have to build, that I built, but it is not just an individual sort of an experience. It is something that I learned from my mother how to do. I learned from my sister. I learned from my Dalit peers. I learned from my grandparents. How else could you have survived thousands of years, facing barriers after barriers, obstacles after obstacles? And these obstacles are everywhere, across domains, across aspects of life, whether it's in dating, whether it's in marriage, whether it is in the schools that you go to, the peers that you're interacting with in your college, in your university, whether it's at work. I think I went through quite a bit of quite a bit of extremely bad experiences at work, where you will have to constantly engage with upper castes who are absolutely oblivious to their positions of privilege, but also are actively offensive to you, except that they haven't started any kind of anti-caste consciousness or anti-caste work within themselves. So they don't even know what they're doing is wrong. Maybe some people do know, but they still continue to do it. But all of these experiences are hardening to you. But how do you get past these? I don't think you get past these right there in that moment. It's just that you, over a period of time, you have developed and you have kind of learned what tools you need to deploy, what tools that you need to have inside of you in order to get going. Simple things would be to write about it, and again, those are things that my people in my family did not have access to, but now I do. So writing definitely helps. I think it's just relatively easier to be Dalit when you have privileges, and I think I, over a period of time, have also acquired a certain amount of class privilege, a certain amount of privilege by virtue of language. So I'm able to articulate what has happened to me, and I have people responding to it quite favorably sometimes. So all of this helps, I think. But back then, I don't think my family or my ancestors had that kind of an opportunity. So they had to develop a certain type of resilience that they also passed on to me.
Thank you so much for that. It's so motivating to hear about the different experiences that you've had and how you've come to overcome them. And just knowing that we can use the support from others and different types of modes of expression with writing and utilizing those tools to get through those moments and strengthen yourself. It's truly inspiring. So thank you for that. So the next question is, your work with Smashboard is focused on intersectional feminism, and would you be able to define this for us, and why is it specifically important amongst South Asian voices?
Yeah, so I think Smashboard is a fantastic example of how a feminist future looks like, right? It's a digital platform that hopefully will become open and public very soon. It's something that it's something that essentially encapsulates what is it that we want to do at the intersection of technology, development, and feminism, right? So essentially, Smashboard is a place where we hope survivors of sexual violence will be able to access all kinds of help, whether it's legal, psychological, social, whatever it is. And my hope and my motivation behind joining Smashboard as an advisor was to be able to provide that access for Dalit women, particularly women who are sexual violence survivors, particularly who are survivors of caste-based sexual violence, right? And it is my hope that we would have gotten to a place that is so technologically advanced that pretty much any survivor will be able to access help. And to me, that is intersectional feminism in action, right? What is intersectional feminism? What is intersectionality? To be able to realize that we are not contained in just single identities. There is absolutely no way on this. It's absolutely no way for anyone to be just a feminist by virtue of their gender expression or gender identity. There are many things other than all of that. And which is why it's important to understand your oppressor location and your oppressed location. Particularly for Dalit women, I cannot see myself as just a woman. Unfortunately, I have to see myself as an oppressed, a caste-affected woman who came from a lower middle class family and who has now caste privilege and who is able-bodied, who is cis, who's queer. So I have to be able to see myself in all of these aspects. That is intersectionality to me. And what Smashboard represents is that we will get to an intersectional space where we are all able to understand our own positionalities in its complexity, in its layering, and still be able to help out each other and still be able to be in solidarity with each other and still be able to see how violence against you by virtue of anything could be extremely debilitating. And what is it that I can do as someone who's privileged for someone who doesn't have that type of privilege?
It's so amazing to hear your cause behind it. Creating a space for these women is such an important thing to do to make sure that we can all interact with one another and share our experiences. Thank you for that. I'm going to move into the participant questions now. One of our participants asks, could you say more about, oh, sorry, I skipped over someone. As someone interested in media and writing and from an oppressor's caste location, how can we make sure that we're not taking space away from Dalit writers, but also still talking about caste in all I write and create?
Sorry, could I see that question?
Yeah.
So I can talk to it.
I'll send it in the chat as well.
As someone interested in media and writing and from an oppressor caste, how can we make sure that we're not taking space from Dalit writers? Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question. Thank you for asking that. So I believe caste is not just about Dalits. And I forgot to mention this in that slide, is that caste does not equate Dalit, right? You can very well still write about caste. And this is what I urge a lot of anti-caste allies, a lot of anti-caste writers to do, is to focus on how caste manifests in your communities and in your collectives and in your families and even within yourself. Write about caste privilege, write about caste power, write about what happens if you were to give up that power, write about, you know, how people acquire power based on caste and how they sustain it and how they keep it, and what do we need to do to break it. Because Dalit writing does not necessarily have to be anti-caste writing, if you think about it, right? Dalit writing can just be about themselves. I can just write about my love for science fiction. I could write about my love for travel, you know, for rocks, for geology. I could just do that. That is still Dalit writing, right? That is still a Dalit writer who is exploring their way of doing it, right? And I could also write about anti-caste politics. I could also write about Dalit emancipation, Dalit empowerment, what it means to be a Dalit woman and to thrive and to survive and to be happy. I could do all of that. And we could both exist in the same space without having to overlap each other's interests. We could totally do that. And this has not been what has been happening, which is why I'm very thankful for your question. To give you an example, you would, if you were to go ahead and if you were to go and Google something like Dalit food, as an example, you would find pieces of writing that were written by upper caste or non-Dalit authors about the foods that are consumed by Dalits, or the foods that have traditionally been consumed by caste-affected communities, and theorizing concepts out of it. So I believe the only reason something like that has happened is because these upper caste writers and authors and non-Dalit writers and authors have been in that positions of access, right? Positions of privilege where they can take up a topic, write about it, submit it to the editor, and the editor would accept it and publish it. While there could be someone like me or someone who doesn't even have the kind of access that I do, who would want to write about the food that they have been consuming for generations, that they would be thinking about, and they would want to write, but simply because they don't have access, or simply because they don't know an editor, simply because there's no one commissioning that piece from them, that they don't have the opportunity to even pen that piece. Or even if they pen that piece, no one would publish it because simply no one is interested, not in the topic, but in the writer. So what they would do is just publish on the blog and no one would even read it. It won't even get any visibility, right? And there's so many such pieces of writing that you discover when you go on this journey of how Dalits have been articulating and have been trying to tell their stories, except that it's the upper caste non-Dalit audience that determines visibility, that determines which piece of writing should gain any kind of market, should gain any kind of visibility, should gain any kind of, prominence. So this is to say that when it comes to culture, when it comes to Dalit culture, or when it comes to Dalit food, anything with respect to Dalit experiences, stay away. It's a simple thumb rule. It will become murky, no doubt about it. There will be topics where this will become murky. And as a journalist and as a writer, you will have to introspect and you will have to have questions for yourself and you will have to have tough conversations. But it's a great place to start. Asking this question is a great place to start.
Thank you so much for your insight on that. I hope that answered that participant's question. Our next question, I'll continue sending them in the chats just so that you can refer.
Sure, yeah.
The next question is, could you speak on the role diasporic South Asians can have in supporting marginalized communities in South Asia? How can we support progressive causes and continue to empower Dalit voices across the world?
Right, thank you. I think again, this is a great question, right? So some answers are fairly straightforward, right? Follow social media handles wherein I think now we have a significant active population on social media who are talking about not just issues and ideologies, but are also putting up news and putting up posts about people who are in need. So if there's anything monetary, if there's anything that you think you can do from a monetary perspective for people who are seeking medical aid, legal aid, any kind of help, please just do it. Because the disparity is just so huge. It's staggering. The level of poverty and the level of deprivation, it's staggering. So if you see any kind of news, of course, do your vetting and do make sure it's genuine and it's authentic and do that kind of homework. But if you see something like that, please do your bit, from a monetary perspective. And if you're unable to do it from a monetary perspective, make sure you amplify it with the resources that you have, with the capital that you have, with the access, with the networks. Make sure you amplify it. You never know, somebody somewhere will be able to help, right? And the same, it's not just monetary. The same goes for, if people are putting out posts about jobs, about opportunities, about writing, commissions, contacts, just do what you can. Like, I am confident that you will know someone somewhere who will be able to help that person, right? And of course, assuming that you do, please do be able to, connect that person. Thirdly, and in terms of, support and, progressive causes and all of this, amplify the work of Dalit movements that are working across the globe. You have the Ambedkar International in the United States, you have Equality Labs, you have several other anti-caste groups that are working in the diaspora in Australia and UK across, and you have a bunch of movements in India as well. So amplify their work, make sure that the world is aware and fully aware of what work we are doing. And also do listen to this talk called Anti-Blackness within South Asian communities. I'll try to find a link before I leave, or I will try to pass it on to Saket, who can pass it on to you. It's a talk by Thenmozhi Soundararajan and Shaista Patel. And of course, this is about anti-Blackness and, a lot of stuff about how casteism transposes as racism. And it's an amazing talk. But why I'm giving that as an answer to this question is that Thenmozhi in that talk talks about, in that conversation, talks quite a bit about what should people within South Asian communities need to do. And I'm not repeating what she's saying only because my context is very limited within the South Asian diaspora in the United States. So if you get a chance to listen to that talk, please do. She does talk about some very specific things in terms of questioning your own beliefs and mindsets, and a whole lot of stuff about organizing as well.
Thank you for that. It's so important to recognize that there are so many different ways to support and so many different networks that you can utilize to find resources. There's a way that everybody can help regardless of how much money you have or how much knowledge you have. So our next question is also from a participant. The question is, as a non-South Asian identifying person, how do I effectively practice anti-caste allyship when any intervention I do might be seen as imposing my education privilege upon a community that views me as an outsider? I've been to Bangalore and witnessed casteism firsthand, but it didn't feel like it was my place to say anything as a guest.
Great. I mean, I relate to that, to be honest, not as somebody who is an outsider, but as someone who's been on the other side. To give you an example, in my former workplace, I had a manager who was a non-Indian, and who wasn't white, but who was non-Indian, and he became interested in the caste question. And so he went to the HR person and asked them, hey, I get this whole thing about, so there's this whole D&I thing that's happening, diversity and inclusion thing that's happening within the Indian corporate space. It's quite a very active space, to be honest. And people there talk about pretty much everything. They talk about gender, they talk about disability, they'll talk about queer issues, they'll talk about, everything except caste. So this person went to them, my manager went to them, who was a non-Indian, and asked the HR person about, there's this thing about caste, right? Why is that you guys aren't talking about caste? And this is in Bangalore, yeah? And the HR person responded to it saying, you have no idea what you're talking about. Stay away from this. And she, in fact, responded saying that you don't know what the Dalits are capable of, and how, of course, she spoke about reservation and affirmative action in a deeply offensive way. And she even said, you should be on our side. So in response to this person said, so there are two sides, then this is war. And I know which side I'm on, right? It might come across as an offensive comment. It might come across as a comment that the guest said without, knowing their place. But I think as a person who belongs to a caste affected community, I thought that was a badass thing to say. I thought that was just amazing that somebody was able to not only intervene and to be able to take the risk of being seen as a guest and being seen as somebody who is not speaking from his place, and to stand by, it's not like there was a caste affected person. It's not like there was a Dalit there and this person kind of superseded or spoke over that Dalit. There was no one there. And it was, my manager felt it was his responsibility to stand, or to stand up and to speak up, and to do the best anti-caste thing it is there for him to do. And he did it. So I don't know. I mean, the decision is yours, really. But if you were to ask someone who has been through discrimination, I would be very glad if you were to call out anything that is casteist that you witness. So if you, as you say in your comment, you have witnessed casteism firsthand, and if you're still in that space, I recommend and I urge you to call them out or call them in, as the case may be.
Thank you for that. I always think it's more important to speak out than not say anything at all, because that shows that you actually care about something and you want to make a difference. So thank you for that. Our next question is, could you say more about how the impacts of casteism and colonialism / colonized thinking manifests itself similarly or differently within the South Asian community? Does engaging in anti-caste activism without attending to the historical context of colonialism make efforts less effective?
Absolutely. These questions are so amazing, so impressive too. Yes, it makes it less effective. In fact, yesterday I read this post about Nritya Pillai, and I thought I saw someone share that link share the link of Nritya Pillai and the work that she does on social media. Is that she talks about decolonizing Bharatanatyam and how the whole discourse on decolonization is so devoid and stripped of caste. Absolutely. I mean, you have to talk about colonization. We have to decolonize, but you also have to see how colonialism, particularly within the context of India, particularly within the context of Western colonialism in India, how caste oppressors, meaning Brahmins and those belong to the upper caste, collaborated with the colonizers to keep their power intact, right? To sustain their powerful positions, to sustain oppression against lower caste. So talk about colonization, but also talk about how colonization has essentially shaken hands with caste in order to come up with something more vicious, something a lot more compounding, a lot more poisonous, a lot more oppressive, right? So to talk about decolonizing yoga and decolonizing Bharatanatyam, decolonizing pretty much everything and anything without talking about caste is not only less effective, it's completely ingenuous, right? And I think, like Nritya says in her post, and I recommend you all to please read it, is that this discourse of decolonization is typically authored and propagated and it's just celebrated by mostly people who belong to upper caste locations, and that is problematic. They are unable to talk about their own positions of caste privilege and power because this decolonization narrative gives them ample reason to just talk about racism, to just talk about Western colonialism, to just talk about white supremacy without having to interrogate caste supremacy or Brahmanism or Brahminical patriarchy, right?
Thank you so much for that. I'm getting another question from another participant. This one's a little bit shorter. What is the role of Dalit members of the South Asian diaspora who have economic and social privileges in anti-caste efforts?
What is the role? I think people are doing quite a bit already Like, for example, one thing that I've seen that has worked out very powerfully and very effectively for people on the ground in India is being able to get Dalit students here and have them access higher education, right? And that's a huge thing uh, for Indians, for particularly for Dalit Indians, who tend to find it quite difficult and quite tough to be part of educational institutions in India. This is not to say that educational institutions outside of India are great. They have their own issues, they have their own problems. But back home, again, the situation could be extremely bad. And I'm not the right person, excuse me, and I'm not the right person to talk about it in such detail because it's been years since I got out of university. But you may have all heard about the case of our dear brother Rohit Vemula, who was killed, and his experience and his letter would tell you the kind of um, atrocious oppression that happens within educational institutions back home in India. And for Dalit students to be able to access higher learning without having to go through those experiences is massive, is consequential, it's huge. So that has been a powerful sort of role that Dalits in the diaspora have been playing. People in the United States, in particular, my partner, he's graduating from Columbia in about 3 weeks' time. He came back to school after having worked for a while. So most of his conversations with Dalit students back home is about how do we get into Columbia? How do we access higher education? So a lot of his advice would be to, okay, these are the things that you need to do. This is how you do your statement of purpose. These are the people that you need to talk to. So, these are kinds of things that you do. A lot of my time is also spent doing that. People would be like, how do I get this job? How do I write my resume? How do I write my application? What do I do? How do I speak to them? I'm moving to, a peer of mine was like, hey, I'm moving to Sweden. I don't know what to take with me. Can you tell me? I mean, chili powder, coriander, what should I do? I mean, these are like really, it may seem like very small things, but for communities who don't have that kind of diasporic capital, or if there's a word like that, who don't have support in the diaspora, it can be extremely intimidating. My move to Singapore was so hard, and it was just Singapore. It's like you have a mini India there, and you have like millions of Indian people there who can make you feel at home, and yet my experience was so intimidating. In retrospect, I feel if there was a Dalit family there, or if there were Dalits in Singapore who I would have known earlier, it could have made things so much more easy for me. So I believe the most powerful role that Dalits in the diaspora are playing, particularly for Dalit students and young Dalit professionals who are trying to kind of migrate and move out and, essentially find futures in other countries.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. We have a couple more questions, so continue to feel free to send them directly to me or Sakith. So the next one that we have here, let me copy and paste it into the chat, is more related to the pandemic. So with COVID-19 putting workers in specific sanitation jobs more at risk, and those jobs being held more by Dalit people, how can we support frontline workers impacted by caste oppression?
Wow, great question. But I don't have much information to give here. How can we support frontline workers impacted by caste oppression? I'm assuming that you're talking about frontline workers in India. Again, what I would urge you to do is follow the work of movements and organizations in India that is working with sanitation workers, that is working with manual scavengers. You may not know this already, or you may, but there is only Dalits are expected to do manual scavenging back home in India. Manual scavenging is illegal, is something that people should not do according to Indian law, but but it continues to happen despite it being outlawed, right, in the 1980s. So, or maybe in the 1990s, I'm not sure about the date, but it has been outlawed, and people continue, and Dalits are still being forced to engage in these jobs, right? So, I would urge you to please just follow the work of organizations that are working with these communities to see if there's anything that you can do. There are people who keep reporting on what's happening for sanitation workers, particularly people who are engaged in, manhole cleaning. Manholes is that a thing in the US, like manholes? These are drainage holes.
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so these are basically drainages that you would find on the road, and they are usually closed. And yeah, okay, and people have to clean it, and in the people who are forced to clean these, and there'll be some blockage somewhere, and people who are forced to clean these are Dalit men specifically, and they lose their lives. And time again, people have pointed out how incredibly dangerous these professions are. In fact, organizations and groups that are working against such professions have been coaxing and lobbying and convincing the government to adopt technologies that can very easily do it without having to put so many people at risk. And yet the government continues to do it. Municipalities continue to do it. So if you find any news reports, or if people who are talking about it and who are doing some kind of organizing or mobilizing around it, do your bit to amplify it, do your bit to talk about it with your friends, your families. And if there's any kind of monetary need that they have put up on social media or elsewhere, and if you come to know of it, please do your bit to help them.
Thank you so much for that. It's so hard to see that we still have people out there who are really risking their lives, and not as many people are aware of it. And it's so important to spread that information so that we can find support for it. So we've talked a lot about your past experiences, how you've come to be what you are today, and we've given a lot of advice to our participants for the things that they're doing on their own. This question is a little bit more geared towards your future. So the question asks, how do you prioritize the goals you are trying to accomplish? What are your goals for the next few months, and how do you plan to achieve them?
How do I prioritize? My goodness, I feel attacked. How do I prioritize my goals? I try to prioritize. You can see this white colored thing that's here. These are the goals that I've put up for myself, half of which I just don't follow, which is really bad. But I'll try to answer your next question. What are your goals for the next few months? Then the goal for the next few months is essentially, I mentioned to you at the start of this presentation that I took a sabbatical. My sabbatical was part personal and part professional. The personal aspect was essentially to just take a mental health break. Caste can be mentally very, very taxing, right? And I don't know, I think I've just been telling myself to I've just been pushing myself constantly. And the thing about being a Dalit person, and this is not just an individual experience, an experience across, is that you are the first person in many contexts. You're not necessarily a pioneer, but you are the first ever Dalit, being in a corporate boardroom in that company, something of that sort. So you're constantly lonely, and you're constantly trying to assess and understand and wonder what you're doing is right or not, how you're smiling and how you're not, if you're talking too much, if you should not, if you come across aggressive, if you're not. There's just a whole bunch of things that keep going on. And all of this can be extremely mentally taxing, right? So after having worked for over 15 years, 12 plus years of corporate, and then 3 years of research, I thought it's time to just take a break. I thought it's time to just chill and do what I've always wanted to do, which is write. So the answer to the second part of your question is to essentially finish my book, which I'm hoping that I'll be more disciplined towards. And hopefully, if all goes well, then we'll have an actual published copy at the middle of next year. Fingers crossed. But that's like my biggest goal for now.
Thank you so much for that. It's very important to realize that we all need a break sometimes, regardless of who you are. Like you're just such an inspiration, and knowing that you're human too and need your breaks is something that we should all recognize for ourselves, especially during this time. We have one more question to wrap up, or we actually might have two. So we have only a couple minutes left, so whatever we get to, we can get to. But this, I think, is referring back to one of your other answers. Someone is asking if you could suggest some organization names who work to eliminate manual scavenging. Oh, I just copied and pasted it wrong.
Okay, let me just, I don't excuse me, please excuse my. Are you all able to see the name that I just wrote, which is Bezvada Wilson? I hope that is the spelling. So this is not the name of an organization. This is the name of a person, and he is one of the most prominent activists within the manual scavenging space, and he's amazing. I've heard him speak, and he also works with organizations. And if you were to go down a Google, sort of a rabbit hole, you will be able to find specific organizations that are working on manual scavenging. Yeah.
Thank you. And if you remember any other organizations that you want to share, just send them over and we'll send them to our participants as well.
Yeah.
Another question I have here. Could you speak a little bit about accountability and self-audit mechanisms when it comes to doing anti-caste work?
Could you type that question for me, Maya?
I don't know why it's not letting me copy and paste. It's only letting me copy like the same thing, so I'm typing it out for you right now.
Maybe I can just scroll up to see that. I just wanted to know what's the accountability.
Okay, I just sent it.
Thank you so much, Maya. I'm sorry about it. Self-audit mechanisms when it comes to doing anti-caste work. I think accountability in general is a very evolving conversation, right? I haven't, to be honest, come to a conclusion about what that optimal accountability mechanisms look like. I haven't, to be honest. And with cancel culture progressing, evolving, expressing itself in different formats, and within the anti-caste space as well, with consequence culture and with accountability, quote unquote, abuse, that's also like a thing. I am not entirely sure as to how to go about doing this, and that's like my honest to heart answer. The best thing I can say is, instead of doing something that you regret and then issuing a long apology about it, you might as well have that conversation with someone that you trust, rather than put it out there and then create that kind of damage. I mean, the problem with such incidents is that even if you do issue a very sound, very perfect apology with the best language, the damage has already been done, right? Very recently, I don't know if you follow these things on Instagram, someone spoke very ill of Bahujan people or lower caste, and There was a huge furor around it. A lot of people, particularly people from caste affected communities, had to, do the labor, call them out, tell them over and over and over again, and then they would issue apology after apology after. Everything was problematic. Like the first apology was problematic, the second apology was problematic, the third apology, everything was problematic. I want to give that person the benefit of the doubt, because it's also quite, it's also possible that you may not be able to offer the perfect apology because you just don't know what the perfect apology looks like, right? And even if you do, you've already created the damage, right? So my suggestion is, it's a journey. You have to keep learning and educating yourself and knowing what is right and what is not, what's offensive and what's not, and what's going to hurt another person and what's not, and what's life affirming and what's not. So these are things that you have to learn, and it's a journey. But in that moment, if you feel pushed or driven to talk about something or to say something, I would suggest that, even if you have an inkling of a doubt, have that conversation with someone that you fully trust, even if you think it is an offensive thought. I would rather have you have that private conversation. I would rather have you sort that out privately in an introspection mode and getting called in by your trusted friend or your trusted person, rather than have that whole accountability, play out in public. It gets ugly for everyone. And at the end of it, we may have lost you as an ally as well. And you may have lost us as friends. So you don't want that to happen. I'm not sure how helpful this is, but this is the most honest answer I can give you.
Those are very good things to keep in mind while we're trying to support our communities. Thank you so much for that. So we are at 11:30, so we're going to be concluding this event. So I want everybody to just give a warm thank you to Christina Dhanaraj for coming out here today and teaching us so much about her life, her work, and how we can be allies in anti-casteism. I really appreciate you coming out today, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. One quick reminder, Saket sent in the group chat a little bit earlier to fill out the check-in raffle Google form. There were about 50 people at the event today, which means that if you fill out the form, you will be getting the ebook regardless of who gets randomly picked. And please come to our next event, which is happening at 12 o'clock in a half hour. It's our gender violence workshop. And it is at the exact same URL, tinyurl.com/SAYI day one. So thank you all for coming to our first keynote speaker event today, and I hope to see you at the rest of the events today as well. Thank you again, Christina.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye. And if anybody has any questions, I'll stay here for a minute or two. If you need to know anything about the schedule, how the raffles work, if you want to be a part of SAYI next year, literally anything that you want to ask, or if you just want to have a chat and you're bored, I'm here.